Hello lads, ladies, gents, ladetts, whoever, whatever, welcome back to another video. During the mid-2000s, the once dominant genre of horror had seemingly started to lose its way. And even though we had plenty of great releases like Dead Space, Left 4 Dead, and a personal favourite of mine, The Darkness, horror games as a whole found themselves relying more on indie titles like the juggernaut Amnesia: The Dark Descent to drum up overall interest, which by 2013 and 2014 respectively, the genre saw somewhat of a massive comeback, with all-time classics like Outlast and the ever-popular Alien Isolation. In the shuffle, a little game by the title of The Evil Within did release, and that's the topic of today's video. Releasing basically at the exact same time as Alien Isolation, with there only being a week between the two, The Evil Within found itself in an uphill battle from the start. And even though it had notable game director Shinji Mikami, which for those who don't know is the creator of Resident Evil, The Evil Within sadly went somewhat underappreciated at the time, and even though it scored well with critics, it just got overshadowed by its competitor. Thankfully, as time has passed, and after a very good sequel, The Evil Within has started to get some more love. I know for me, I didn't check this game out until quite a while after its release, because even though I did get it at release, the game had some performance issues that we will talk about later. Being a third-person survival horror game, The Evil Within sees itself as a mix of the genre's giants, with those being Resident Evil and Silent Hill, which as you can imagine leads to a mix of amazing atmospheres and a mind-bending plot that I'm going to do my best to explain. However, this does mean there's going to be some spoilers here. I will leave certain things pretty vague so it doesn't ruin the entire experience, but do understand there are still going to be some major spoilers here. We're going to be dealing with a cult, an evil company, betrayal, and experiments. Originally starting out with a group of 3 detectives, Sebastian, Joseph, and Julie, pulling up to a crime scene that can only be described as a bloody massacre in which they only find a single survivor, Dr. Jimenez, who really reminds me of Anthony Hopkins from the Hannibal Lecter movies.
A census taker once tried to test me. I ate his liver with some fava beans and a nice Chianti.
Eventually looking at a monitor, the player character Sebastian sees a seemingly supernatural killer take out 3 cops with no effort, only to turn around and have him behind him. After this encounter, things start to take a turn for the worse, with the world seemingly being turned upside down. You are forced to find your way back to the group. On this journey, Sebastian comes across tons of carnage, making you wonder if you're still in the same hospital, and if so, what the hell is going on? Eventually getting back to the group, the world itself seems to be completely crumbling around them, and it's very reminiscent of those scenes in Inception. And this comparison to Inception is a lot more fitting than you would think, as you eventually find out that everything is running in a simulation world based on the brain of Ruvik, our killer from earlier, with him being able to insert his consciousness at any point, with his ultimate goal being to put his consciousness into the patient named Leslie. One of the major complaints I've heard about The Evil Within is the fact it has a very confusing story, and it's definitely a maze to navigate for sure. But if you keep in mind that this world is from Ruvik's perspective, things start to make a little bit more sense, especially the game's symbolism. It still has plot holes for sure, and not everything is going to hit, but I personally enjoyed it for what it is. Also, in order to get the most out of the story, you really do need to find those collectibles, as they help flesh out a lot of the things going on and a lot of the behind the scenes information. Another fault with the game I would say that is definitely agreeable is the characters themselves, and although they're mostly well voice acted and very well modelled, a lot of the personalities come off as nothing more than surface level. As mentioned just before, a lot of the behind the scenes story related moments are delivered through collectibles that you read, so we don't really get to see how that character came to be after these events. Where The Evil Within starts to separate itself from a lot of its peers, at least to me, is the overall atmosphere and general level design. Starting out a lot more open-ended, these levels themselves gradually become more linear and a lot more corridor in nature. And on paper that sounds bad, but it's almost as if the world itself is closing in on Sebastian as he is getting closer to the end. It's a really nice touch, and yes, it might not necessarily be deliberate symbolism, and it could have just been lazy game design technically, but I actually really like it. It means I never spend too much time going from A to B, and that's good, because the game's checkpoint system drove me nuts. This doesn't mean the game doesn't reward exploration. If anything, it does. From ammo, brain gel, crafting materials, supplies, and even weapons, you're going to find something useful in pretty much every nook and cranny. It means your time never feels wasted, and it makes the overall experience a lot better than you would expect. You only start out with a revolver, so you're definitely going to want to explore to get different weapons. Eventually you'll get a crossbow, shotgun, sniper rifle, and even a magnum, giving you a pretty decent core selection. You'll also get access to grenades that work exactly how you'd expect, as well as finding some single-use items like the axe or torch. And even though they are only single-use, they are pretty much instant kills on anything you use them against, so definitely use them when you can. What makes the combat very addictive is the match system. Upon knocking enemies down, if you have a match, you can then set them on fire, instantly killing them. And if you time it right, as a bonus, you can actually kill multiple enemies, which ends up saving you tons of ammo. The only drawback to combat is the fact pretty much every boss will have access to one-hit kills. However, once you know what you're doing, they basically become a non-issue, but do prepare to die a lot as you figure things out. The game itself isn't actually that hard to navigate, all things considered. However, what does make it a little bit frustrating is the fact that you can only run for a matter of 2 seconds. This is a seasoned detective and my fat ass is outrunning him, so you're going to need to upgrade this as soon as possible. This is where the brain gel that I mentioned earlier comes into play. It gives you a reason to explore, find, and kill every enemy that you can get your hands on in order to get as many upgrade points as possible. A lot of these upgrades are very basic in nature, being nothing more than upgrades to the amount of ammo you can hold, more damage, and things of that nature. You won't get every upgrade on your first run, incentivizing you to play again. But by the end game, you definitely will notice the difference, especially in the sprint. Because of how well the game rewards you, it makes it actually very enjoyable to spend your time just looking through everything. Sure, the checkpoint system can be a little bit frustrating, especially after you die, as I've mentioned already, but beyond that, you're definitely going to have a good time here. What also helps you enjoy this time exploring is the game's overall presentation, and with the exception of the film grain effect that can definitely be a little too invasive at points, the overall design is very twisted and intriguing. It makes you ask questions: what the hell's going on with this monster? Why does it look this way? It makes things a joy to explore, especially towards the second half of the game when the world is morphing around you, lending itself to that Inception comparison that I made earlier. I will say the sound design itself is only serviceable, as the weapons themselves sound a bit weak, but beyond that, everything sounds pretty decent, and I would say it's on par with games of its era. I will say the OST is definitely standout and worth a listen. It would fit in any horror movie for sure, and honestly, its rendition of Claire de Lune might just be my favourite, even if it might be a little bit of a cliche pick. Where the game might lose some players is the fact the so-called puzzles are nothing more than go find X item and bring it to X location, and although it's a perfectly functional system, it's something that I would have liked to have seen just a little bit more depth for. Personally, I wouldn't have minded the odd riddle or odd question requiring me to pay attention to those logs, because overall, even though I do want to know the story and I did read them, I could definitely see myself getting bored of them and just skimming through by the end. I will say the boss fights are a little bit hit or miss as well. Even though I did enjoy every single one, I could definitely see where people might not necessarily like them. They're a little bit repetitive and I would have liked a little bit more variety, but considering this was a new game and a new IP from a brand new studio, I can understand why they played it a little bit safe. The level variety itself does make up for a lot of these shortcomings though, as the levels themselves can be a bit more of a puzzle. For example, the level that has a ton of gas that can be exploded if you use a normal weapon. It restricts you to just a crossbow and your own sense of timing in order to hide from the enemies. It's really cool and it's a nice change of pace. It doesn't take too long to get through, meaning the game keeps pushing forward, and it's a great strength. It can get a little bit slowed by the end, but for the most part the game's pacing is really damn solid, with each of the game's 15 chapters taking somewhere roughly from 30 minutes to an hour to beat. So up until this point, I hope I've been mostly positive, even though I have pointed out some minor flaws, but that's what they are, minor. There is one major flaw though that The Evil Within has, and this is just my experience, but from what I understand, it's pretty universal, and that's the game's performance. It is still to this day just all over the place. It might not necessarily show in the footage that I've used for this video, but I had constant frame rate issues. I would be in the high 70s 1 second, down to the mid 40s, then back up to 100, and then down to 35. It was just super inconsistent. I also did try the game without recording as well to see if the frame rate issues persisted to the same extreme, and they did improve somewhat. However, there was still some inconsistencies. For the most part, it did run at a rock solid 120 FPS for me on my hardware. However, in saying that, there were certain sections, especially a chase scene that's in about the middle of the game, that actually becomes unplayable because of the way the physics are tied to the frame rate. So you do have to lower it down to that 30 FPS cap. With this said though, it does improve somewhat, but do keep in mind you are still going to run into these issues, and you might even need to be forced to run it at a lower frame rate to get certain things to work. Now, thankfully I didn't run into any crashes in my time with the game this time, as originally when I tried to play the game, it was nearly unplayable. I would basically get to about halfway through the game, and by then it was crashing constantly, making me get frustrated and stop playing altogether. From what I understand, the console version is a little bit more stable when it comes to the overall performance, and it's just the PC port that is buns. But it makes me kind of hope we get a remaster sometime down the line, because I think this game deserves a lot more love than it gets. And even though I did mention that it has been getting some love, I think it deserves a lot more. It's an IP with a ton of potential, and I would love to see an Evil Within 3. However, unfortunately, developers Tango Gameworks have been absorbed by ZeniMax and shut down, meaning realistically we're probably not going to see it. And even though creator Shinji Mikami has created another new game studio, as far as I'm aware he doesn't own the IP, so he won't be able to work on an Evil Within 3 unless contracted to do so. Fingers crossed, but I really doubt it. So with that, lads, ladies, gents, ladettes, whoever, whatever, it brings us to the end of another video. I hope you enjoyed this look back at the Evil Within. I also hope you have a lovely Halloween and everyone stays safe and enjoys their time in the spooky season. I don't really celebrate it, but hey, I know some people absolutely love it. If you enjoyed the video, please consider hitting that like button. If you want to go that extra step, you can hit the subscribe button. If you want to go that extra mile, you can support me on Ko-fi from just $1 a month like these lovely people here. And with that, I will see you guys in the next one. Stay safe out there. Bye.